almost feel snobby for saying this, but I liked Insomniac games before it was cool. Sure, they were a great and well-known developer well before Sony finally purchased them in 2019, but they were nowhere near as popular or well-known as they are now. While they've been producing great games like Spyro and Ratchet & Clank for nearly 30 years now, they really were put on the map in 2018 with the release of Spider-Man PS4. From the addicting gameplay to the characters and story, the game received widespread acclaim, and their follow-up semi-sequel in 2020 further cemented their knack for making superhero games. While shorter than the original game, Miles Morales was a great continuation and an excellent launch title for the new PlayStation 5, only making people more excited for the eventual full sequel. Well, the wait is finally over, as Marvel's Spider-Man 2 launched on the PS5 on October 20th. In some ways, this serves as Insomniac's best installment yet in the franchise, and yet, for some reason, I also find myself preferring the previous two entries over it. While technical marvel for sure, pardon the pun, I can't help feeling that the small details in the overall picture make it just an ever so slightly weaker experience compared to the previous two ones. We'll go ahead and start with the gameplay. The gameplay in Spider-Man 2 is largely the same as the last two games, with slight tweaks simplify things to a degree that I don't particularly care for. The biggest thing for me is the change in combat, which I'll preface that my major complaint here is mainly one of preference, that there's not really anything wrong with the changes that have been made. As opposed to the first two games, there isn't a weapon wheel to select your gadgets on the fly. Instead, the gadgets and abilities are now pared down and activated by hitting a trigger button followed by one of the face buttons. While this does help keep combat flowing and makes it easier to parry enemy attacks on the fly, personally speaking, I do prefer the weapon wheel. The reason being is that as a longtime Ratchet & Clank fan, I've grown accustomed to that little bit of slowed time, allowing you to quickly strategize based on what tools you have ammo for during a fight. And seeing Insomniac keep that throughout several of their other games felt like a nice little treat that links their games together. Now, from a more objective standpoint, linking the gadgets and special moves to the face buttons and removing the wheel does probably improve the combat, so I can't really fault them for making the change. And I did have my own share of complaints with the gadget selection in the first game, as some of them didn't really feel like they were Spider-Man type gadgets anyway. Miles Morales, however, nullified that problem by giving you a more limited selection to choose from, making every gadget count or removing some filler. The gadget selection this time around seems to be an in-between situation, as while the gadgets do feel more in line with being Spider-Man based, a few of them make combat feel a bit like a cheat. The ricochet webs are the biggest offender, as immediately after unlock they help grant extra combo points that recharge your other abilities. I didn't end up unlocking this tool until the endgame though, so I didn't really mind that it made things too easy for me, as by that time I was just mopping up extra side quests anyway. But I could see someone about halfway through the game unlocking the ricochet webs and feeling a little cheated out of a challenge. But that's certainly a case of personal preference, I think, rather than an issue with the game design itself. One addition I do love is the web wings. Many complain that they take away from the point of being Spider-Man, but I think they actually add to it. It just depends on how you use them. While you can just use them to glide across a city and never touch the ground, there's even a trophy for that, I'd argue that's not really the way they're meant to be used. The web wings are meant to be an additive to the web's wing, not a replacement. If you're doing it right, then you can use the wings to traverse over larger gaps and stay higher in the air longer, which will then allow you to keep your momentum for swinging going longer. And the swinging this time around is somehow even better than before. The speed you can reach while swinging is insane, especially with Miles. Given that he's younger and smaller than Peter, Miles moves much quicker while swinging, and you can use that to really get up to speed quickly while swinging, not to mention certain abilities that you can unlock can only help increase that time. Even more than the prior two games, it's exhilarating to just swing around the city and take care of whatever crimes pop up along the way. And speaking of the city, there's some significant additions this time around. While the main Manhattan map doesn't get too many upgrades, both Brooklyn and Queens are added, allowing Spider-Man to cross the river for the first time in these games. Now it gives players 2 islands to play on, doubling the map size from the original game. And with it comes a myriad of new side quests and activities, but many of them are really only new in name only. Combat trials, eco-friendly activities, and random encounters all remain largely unchanged from the first two games. They just have new factions and logos to go with. However, it's not as repetitive as I'm making it sound. Each side activity line does have a good payoff to it, either being a fitting conclusion to an existing story arc presented in the game, or building up new stories to feature in an inevitable sequel. There are several side missions that do a really great job of delving deep into the characters we know, and some of them we don't know quite as well. One particular standout to me was playing as Haley, who is a deaf teenager, and the audio in the game is significantly lowered while playing as her. New puzzles are also in the game after being absent in Miles Morales. While many hate having to hit the skip button past them, but none of them are very hard, and I enjoy the optional variety in the gameplay. Call me crazy, but I think they're fun little side objectives to attempt. Overall, though, the gameplay loop and side activities are just mild alterations on what we've had before, albeit probably being the best we've ever had thus far in a series. The same can't quite be said for the story, however. Unfortunately, I think the story is probably the weakest aspect of the game. It's not bad by any means, but it does feel a little more familiar and been there, done that than the original game or Miles Morales' stories were. The game picks up following the end of Miles Morales, where he and Peter are now both Spider-Man and work together to keep the city safe. Meanwhile, Harry Osborn seems to be cured from his unnamed medical condition that killed his mother and is back among his friends. But of course, not all is well in New York, as Kraven the Hunter has arrived in search of the ultimate prey and begins working his way through New York's supervillains' population to find it. The setup here is good, especially coming off the previous two games. And overall, I think the story is good, but a few small details end up bringing it down and make it the weakest storyline of the three games so far. From here on out, I'll be discussing spoilers, so if you haven't played the game yet and don't want to be spoiled, skip to this timestamp. So moving forward, ironically, or I suppose fittingly, depending on how you look at it, for a game whose major theme is balance, Spider-Man 2 oddly struggles with that. While Peter and Miles are both Spider-Man, the middle part of the game struggles with providing a proper balance between the two characters, and Miles often feels like an unfortunate afterthought at times. There are several story beats in the game where I was expecting Miles to show up and help Peter out of a jam, only for him to never arrive. The game makes them out to feel like a team, and they do at the start, but as time goes on, they feel less and less like that's the case. Now, to a degree, that is part of the story, but it's not handled well enough to really reinforce the game's themes. There are several sections in the first act where Peter should be calling Miles in for backup, but he doesn't, and no one ever mentions it or points it out as a problem. Given Miles had just left Coney Island not long before Kraven's Hunters attack, Peter should have immediately called him in for backup, or they could have included some dialogue where he started to but then decided not to out of overconfidence. Then, later, when Miles is upset about being ignored a little bit because Peter is busy with Harry, that would help play into those fears and insecurities in his overall arc in the game. Same would be true for Peter, as the strength afforded to him through the symbiote suit would allow him to be a better Spider-Man and not need help from anyone. He even says that the suit makes him a better Spider-Man in the game, so tweaking a few of these things would just help reinforce that story point ever so slightly. I also think the villains are weaker this time around compared to the previous game. Kraven is probably the best of the bunch, as he wants to get one final hunt in to go down on his own terms before cancer does him in. And I really like that he actually succeeds in doing this, even if the results are a little messy. Kraven is a simple but effective villain driven by a single goal who doesn't care who gets in his way. To some, that probably makes him a little boring, as it's pretty standard villain fare at this point, but I think he's at least more interesting than this game's take on Venom. Thematically, I totally understand what they're going for with Venom here. The symbiote in this game amplifies a person's doubts and fears and instincts, making them lash out at whatever could hurt them. It's a little deeper than just making the wearer aggressive like some other incarnations. There's at least a purpose behind the aggression here. The biggest problem with Venom, though, is that he doesn't actually show up until the third act of the game, which doesn't leave much time to build a personality for him, or give his voice actor Tony Todd much to work with, which is unfortunate since that's terrific casting. It can also be argued that Venom himself doesn't really have any motivations that are his own either, as he's simply a parasite latching onto Harry's wants and emotions. He wants to heal the world and help, but through his twisted symbiote-infested mind, that means turning everyone into bloodthirsty monsters. Even his desire to infect Peter with the symbiote is just because Harry wants his friend back. Since Venom is just piggybacking off of Harry's thoughts, Venom isn't really a true villain of the game. It's actually Harry. At one point in the game, I thought I had it all figured out where this was going and how character motivations were going to line up. And to some degree, I was right, but not as much as I wish I was. Since Venom was being used as a walking cure for cancer, his desire to be attached to Peter and not Harry would have been so easy to write. After who knows how long of being attached, Venom is tired of constantly having to heal Harry's body, and when he attaches himself to Peter, he now knows what true power feels like. It would go a step further into helping Venom feel like his own character, not just a giant toothy extension of Harry's aggression. Even during the final boss fights, the writing was clear that you weren't really fighting Venom, you were fighting Harry wearing a symbiote. I'm not a comic purist who says Venom must always be Eddie Brock and any other version is invalid, but giving Venom his own personality would have been nice. That all being said, it still works. It's not as if the way it was presented doesn't make sense. It does, but it's just not quite the slam dunk I was hoping for. And writing aside, the presentation of Venom is handled really well. He's a hulking monster compared to our heroes and extremely powerful. That's clear from the moment you get the black suit to when you actually get to play as him. On that front, they handled Venom perfectly. And it's a shame that they don't allow you to play as him in more than one level. Maybe they'll add some DLC that'll allow you to free roam as him around the city or something. And then we have Miles' side story, which is actually developed a little better than Peter's. Early in the game, there's a prison break, which allows Mr. Negative to escape. Given that he was responsible for the death of Miles' father in the first game, Miles is appropriately torn about what to do about this. While predictable that Miles eventually comes to terms with his emotions on the issue and lets him go, playing through Miles actively fighting his inner demons and emerging stronger because of it was well handled. From the environment to the story to the music, that moment had me sitting in goosebumps and is one of the reasons why I love superhero stories. So overall, while the story is good, it doesn't quite reach the heights that I wish it could have, as I think the other games did reach those heights for the most part. By the end of the first game, I was all in on the conflict between Peter and Doc Ock, and I'll forever remember the ending as one of the all-time great emotional boss battles. For whatever reason, I never connected with Harry and Peter's relationship the same way. I don't want to say two's story is more predictable than one's, as everyone that knows anything about comics pretty much knows where we're going from the start of the game in both cases. But maybe the similarities between the two are too close, as the major conflict of both games centers around a friend with an alien body doing whatever they can to survive as their mind is warped partially through forces beyond their control. Say what you will about Simon Krieger and Miles Morales, but Finn and the Underground at least make for some more unique antagonistic forces compared to the first game to help differentiate them. But these small complaints about how parts of the story are handled aren't really that big of a deal. The larger problems are the technical hiccups. While nothing game-breaking, every so often something will pop up that will either require a reset back to the menu or checkpoint. There's also the occasional smaller issue like a flickering texture here and there, but nothing too bad. It does strike me as odd that these are here, as Insomniac usually runs a pretty tight ship and bugs like these don't slip through often. Mainstream reviewers also didn't comment on these in their pre-release builds, and some have mentioned that the bugs didn't pop up until they were updated with the day 1 patch. So while nothing horrendous, it's still odd to see them pop up from time to time. And if anything, I'm surprised there aren't more bugs in the game with how well it runs the rest of the time. The game is still vastly impressive on a technical level, even with the bugs included. The fast travel across the city is near instantaneous, which is just bonkers with a map this size. A clear example of the power of the PS5 SSD, and it makes me wonder just where exactly they can go from here to continue improving things and making things even more impressive. So with all that said, what's the best deal? While I have more issues with it compared to the previous two pretty much across the board, none of them are big enough to squash my overall enjoyment of the game. For the work that they've done here, I'd say the game is probably worth $60. Not quite worth full price, but it's still more than worth your time, whether you're a fan of comics, quick-moving games, open-world titles, or just PlayStation Studios in general. Given the work that Insomniac has already put into this generation, I think we may have a potential new contender for Best PlayStation Studio. If they keep it up, we've got plenty more to look forward from them on the PS5.